Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about section 7.2, which is on complementary and supplementary angles. Our first key idea for this section is that of complementary angles. Go ahead and fill in your blanks in your notes. Two angles are complementary angles when the sum of their measures is 90 degrees. Two angles are complementary angles when the sum of their measures is 90 degrees. In other words, two angles are complementary angles when they add up. This word sum means they add up to 90 degrees. In our first example, we have an angle that has a measure of 30 degrees and another angle with measure of 60. Now when I add 30 and 60 together, I end up with a total sum of 90 degrees. So that pair of angles is complementary. Similarly, in this second example, I have angle 1 and angle 2, and when I put them together or right next to each other, I get this right angle, which is also 90 degrees. So if I were to add angle 1 and angle 2, even though I don't know what their measures are, I know that together they have a sum of 90 degrees. Therefore, angles 1 and 2 are complementary angles. Down below, we're going to go ahead and tell whether these angles are complementary. All we need to do is add up the angles and see if they have a sum of 90. In this black angle, my first measure is 47. So I'm going to start with 47 and add the other measure of 53. When I add 47 and 53, I get a total measure of 100 degrees, meaning that this entire angle has a measure of 100 degrees. Since that is not 90 degrees, these angles are not complementary. Similarly, for this pair of blue angles, I'm going to start with the first angle of 32 and add the second angle of 58. When I add the two angles together, I find that their sum is 90 degrees. Therefore, these two angles are complementary angles. On our next slide, we're going to be talking about supplementary angles. This is a very similar concept, except that two angles are supplementary angles when the sum of their measures is 180 degrees. Again, two angles are supplementary angles when the sum of their measures is 180 degrees. So the word complementary means the angles add up to 90, but the word supplementary means that the angles add up to 180 degrees. So in the examples, I'm going to check to see if these two angles are supplementary by simply adding them together. When I add 135 and 45, I do obtain a sum of 180. Therefore, those two angles are supplementary. In the second example, I have angle 3 and angle 4, and together, when we put them right next to each other, they make a full straight line, starting at 3 and going all the way through to the other side of 4. A straight line is 180 degrees. Therefore, angles 3 and 4 are supplementary angles. Even though we don't know the measure of angle 3 or the measure of angle 4, we know that together they make that straight line, which is 180 degrees. In our examples down below, I'm going to check to see if this first pair is supplementary by simply adding 124 with 56. When we add 124 and 56, we get 180. Therefore, these two angles are supplementary angles. For the second pair, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. I have one angle with a measure of 97. I'm going to add that to the other angle, which is 85, to see if we have a sum of 180. However, when I do this, I do not get 180. Instead, I get 182. Therefore, these two angles are not supplementary. On our next slide, in example 1, we're now going to go through 3 different examples and see what is the relationship between the angles. Are they complementary, meaning do they add up to 90? Are they supplementary, meaning they add up to 180? Or maybe they're neither, so they add up to neither 90 or 180. In example A, I'm going to start with my angle of 70 and add that to my other angle of 110. When I do this, I do get a sum of 180. Since the sum is 180, that means that the two angles are supplementary to one another. In letter B, I'm going to take my first angle of 41 and add that to my second angle of 49. When I add 41 and 49, I do get a 90-degree angle. So these two together make a perfect right angle, and therefore they are complementary angles. You can think complementary has a C for corner, and these two angles make a perfect 90-degree corner with one another. Supplementary angles will make a straight line. If we were to put these two angles together, we would end up with a perfect 180-degree straight line. So C for corner, S for straight line. It might help you remember the relationship between the two. Lastly, letter C, I'm going to take my 128 and add 62, and I end up with a total angle measure of 190 degrees. This is neither 90 or 180, so this is neither. And simply by looking at the picture, you can see that we do not get a perfect straight line or a 90-degree corner for these angles, so therefore it must be neither. In example 2, letter A, we need to first determine the relationship between these two. If I'm trying to find the value of x, I need to relate that to my total picture. Well, what I know is that 4x is part of this 90-degree angle. That means that 4x and the other angle of 36, these two have to be complementary, because when I put them together, I get that 90-degree angle. So these angles have a complementary relationship. And what that means is that I can add them up, 4x plus 36, and I will get a total measure of 90 degrees. If I take this 4x and add on this 36, I get that whole angle, which is 90 degrees, as we see from this little red marking. Well, now from here, if I'm trying to find x, I simply go through solving the equation to get x by itself. I want the 4x isolated first, so I subtract 36 from the left and from the right. When I do that, I end up with 4x is equal to 54. Then I divide by 4 to get x by itself. And I find that x equals 54 over 4, which we can reduce if I divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2. I get 27 in the numerator and 2 in the denominator, which means that x is equal to 27 over 2. And you can leave your answer as an improper fraction just like that. In example B, it's very similar, except now the angle x and the angle x plus 4 don't make a 90-degree angle. Instead, they make a straight line, which has a measure of 180. Since these make a straight line, they are supplementary angles. And so I can take the first, which has a measure of x, and add the second one, which is x minus 4. And when I add, I find that their sum is 180 degrees. And now from here, we just solve. Before we can do anything, I need to combine these two x's on the left. I have 1x plus 1 more x, which gives me 2 x's. I still have minus 4 equals 180. Now I need to isolate 2x, so I add 4 to the left and to the right of my equation. And 2x is equal to 184. Dividing by 2 on the left and on the right, I find that x is equal to 92. On our next slide, I'd like you to go ahead and take a moment to pause the video and try these next 5 on your own or with your group. In the first 3, you simply need to find the sum of the angles to see whether the sum is 90, so the angles are complementary, whether it's 180, so they're supplementary, or maybe it's neither of the two, so the relationship between the angles is neither complementary nor supplementary. And then in 4 and 5, we know that the relationship is either complementary or supplementary, so we will be using that to find the value of x. Go ahead and pause the video and please do these 5 now. In number 1, when we add 26 and 64, we do get 90 degrees, therefore these angles are complementary. In number 2, when I add 44 and 136, I get 180, so these angles are supplementary. And lastly, when I add 70 and 19, I get a measure of 89. Even though that's really close to 90, it is not 90, so these have neither complementary nor supplementary relationship. In number 4, since the two angles make a straight line, I'm going to add the 4x plus 5 with the other angle of 41 to get a sum of 180. So 4x, and I'm going to combine like terms to get plus 46 equals 180. Subtract 46 from both sides of the equation. We have 4x equals 134. Dividing by 4 on the left and on the right, I have x equals 134 over 4, but we can reduce that by at least 2. When I divide by 2, I get 67 in the numerator and 2 in the denominator. So x is equal to 67 over 2. I can't reduce it any farther, so I'll just leave it as an improper fraction. Lastly, when I add my two angles, these are complementary angles, which means that when I add them together, x plus 2x minus 3, I get a measure of 90 degrees. I'm going to combine like terms. I have 1x plus 2 more x's, which gives me 3 x's. Take away 3 equals 90. Now I'll add 3 to both sides to isolate the x term. This leaves us with 3x is equal to 93. And lastly, I divide by 3 on both sides of the equation to find that x is going to have a value of 31. And that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all have an excellent rest of your day.